Catherine of Aragon is the only wife Henry VIII could not break. She was publicly set aside, stripped of her title, and separated from her daughter Mary. Yet every step of the way, she refused to accept the king's version of the truth. Henry believed he could erase her with a legal statement. He believed he could redefine their marriage with a signature. He was wrong. This is not a story about a quiet queen losing her place. It is the story of a direct confrontation between Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, one that forced the king to change the religious structure of England just to defeat her. She stood alone with no army, no political faction behind her, and no institutional power. But she understood the law, the church, and her rights better than anyone at court. That knowledge made her dangerous. To the Tudor government, Catherine was supposed to disappear quietly. She was expected to accept the role of a political inconvenience, an aging queen who could not produce a male heir. Henry's entire justification for ending the marriage depended on redefining Catherine's past. He claimed her first marriage, to his brother Arthur, made their union invalid from the beginning. It was a legal argument designed to trigger an annulment, not an honest search for truth. But Catherine refused to support this narrative. She insisted her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, making her union with Henry entirely lawful. Her statement was consistent, unwavering, and directly challenged Henry's claim that God had cursed their marriage. For Catherine, the issue was not only personal. If she accepted Henry's argument, her daughter Mary would be declared illegitimate. That outcome was unacceptable. Catherine understood the stakes long before Henry announced his intent to remarry. She saw every political shift, every legal maneuver, and every court alliance forming around Anne Boleyn. She recognized that Henry's pursuit of a son justified increasingly aggressive actions. Yet she believed that the king could not simply redefine a lawful marriage because he wanted to. In her view, the church, not the English crown, held authority over marriage. This disagreement placed Catherine and Henry on a collision course. The king needed Catherine to accept a quiet annulment so he could secure a male heir with Anne Boleyn. Catherine needed to defend the legitimacy of her daughter and the stability of the Tudor succession. As soon as she chose not to comply, the conflict escalated beyond personal tension. It became a constitutional crisis. The confrontation that followed reshaped England. Henry moved to override papal authority. He dismantled centuries of religious structure to resolve a domestic dispute. The English Reformation began not with a theological argument, but with Henry's determination to silence Catherine's legal position. She had become the primary obstacle between the king and the future he wanted. Catherine's resistance created political shockwaves across Europe. Spain supported her. Rome stalled the annulment proceedings for years. English nobles were forced to choose sides. Henry's frustration escalated into punitive measures, isolating Catherine, controlling Mary, and removing her supporters from court. To understand why Catherine risked everything, we must look at the core of her downfall. It began with the one thing she could never give the king, a surviving male heir. But the crisis that followed was far greater than a matter of succession. It was the result of a queen defending the legality of her marriage and the legitimacy of her child against a king determined to rewrite the rules of power. For more than 20 years, Catherine of Aragon served as Henry VIII's lawful wife and queen. She provided political stability through her Spanish heritage, strengthened England's international alliances, and produced the Tudor dynasty's first surviving child, Mary. To Henry, these achievements were no longer enough. The absence of a surviving male heir had turned a once stable marriage into a source of anxiety and political vulnerability. Every pregnancy that failed, every miscarriage, every stillbirth, deepened Henry's conviction that something was fundamentally wrong. Henry interpreted these losses not as misfortune, but as divine judgment. In his view, God was punishing him. And the reason, he believed, lay in the one detail Catherine had defended for decades: her first marriage to Henry's older brother, Arthur. Under canon law, marrying a brother's widow was forbidden unless the first marriage had not been consummated. Catherine swore repeatedly, publicly and privately, that she had never completed the marriage with Arthur. Her statement was essential for the church to approve her union with Henry in 1509. For decades, Henry accepted this explanation. But when he began searching for a justification to end the marriage, this point became his primary argument. Henry now claimed he no longer believed Catherine. This shift was not sudden. It developed as Henry's personal desires aligned with his political ambitions. Henry wanted a male heir to secure the Tudor succession. He wanted stability, recognition, and continuity. But he also wanted Anne Boleyn, a woman who refused to be his mistress and demanded marriage as the price for her loyalty. These pressures intersected and produced a single conclusion in Henry's mind: Catherine had to be removed. Behind Catherine's back, Henry had already begun preparing the legal and political groundwork for replacing her. He instructed scholars to search scripture for evidence that their marriage violated divine law. He forced bishops and advisors to review the terms of her first marriage. He convinced himself, and demanded others agree, that their union had always been invalid. This was not a theological crisis. It was a structured legal strategy meant to achieve a predetermined outcome. At court, the shift became visible long before any formal move toward annulment. Anne Boleyn gained influence. Catherine found herself increasingly isolated from political decisions. Her allies were removed or reassigned. Ambassadors reported growing tension, noting that Henry no longer spoke of Catherine as a partner, but as an obstacle. For the first time in her life, Catherine faced not a foreign enemy or diplomatic challenge, but the collapse of her own marriage under political pressure. Henry's argument relied on a simple but powerful premise. If their marriage was invalid in God's eyes, then he had the right, perhaps even the duty, to end it. This allowed him to frame the issue not as betrayal or personal desire, but as a matter of religious obedience. This framing was essential. It provided Henry with a legal shield, a justification he could present to Parliament, the Church, and foreign powers. Catherine understood the implications immediately. If Henry succeeded in declaring their marriage invalid, then Mary would be labeled illegitimate. Her daughter would lose her status, her inheritance, and her claim to the throne. Everything Catherine had built over 2 decades, diplomatic influence, public trust, and dynastic legitimacy, would collapse with a single judgment. The threat was not only political, it was personal. It undermined Catherine's honesty, her honor, and her decades of service to England. Henry's new narrative transformed her from a respected queen into a barrier to royal succession. Once this perspective took hold, the rest followed quickly. Pressure from advisors, pressure from Anne Boleyn's faction, and pressure from Henry himself. By the time Catherine realized the full scope of the crisis, Henry had already made his decision. He would pursue Anne Boleyn, he would secure an annulment, and he would restructure the political and religious landscape of England if necessary. The king's determination left only one question. How far would Catherine go to resist? Catherine did not retreat. She did not accept the title Henry offered to diminish her status. She did not support his claim that their marriage was cursed. Instead, she prepared for confrontation, legal, political, and spiritual. This was the moment when a private marriage crisis turned into a national conflict. Catherine would not surrender, and Henry was not prepared for the scale of resistance she was about to unleash. Henry VIII expected Catherine of Aragon to obey. For 2 decades, she had fulfilled every duty expected of a queen, political, diplomatic, and ceremonial. But when Henry demanded she accept the annulment of their marriage, he encountered resistance he had not anticipated. Catherine refused to validate a legal argument she considered false, and she refused to cooperate in a process designed to replace her. The conflict moved from private disagreement to public confrontation in 1529, when Henry summoned Catherine to the Blackfriars Tribunal in London. This was a formal court convened to determine the validity of their marriage. The king believed the outcome was already decided. Most judges were English. His advisors supported his position. Anne Boleyn's faction dominated the palace. Henry saw the trial as a final step toward freeing himself. But Catherine altered the dynamic the moment she entered the hall. In front of nobles, clergy, ambassadors, and the king himself, Catherine rose from her seat, crossed the chamber floor, and knelt directly before Henry VIII. It was a calculated act, not emotional, but strategic. By kneeling before the king, she turned the tribunal from a legal procedure into a public judgment of Henry's conduct. "Sir, I am your true wife, before God, before this kingdom." These words immediately reframed the trial. Catherine was not defending her dignity, she was asserting her lawful status. Catherine argued her position with precision. She insisted that her marriage to Henry was valid under canon law. She repeated once again that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, removing any religious barrier to her union with Henry. She stated she had never misled the church, never contradicted the truth, and never violated her oath. In her view, the king's case had no legal foundation. She then challenged the jurisdiction of the court itself. According to church law, only Rome, not England, had the authority to judge the validity of a marriage between monarchs. By making this point publicly, Catherine exposed the central weakness in Henry's legal strategy. If the case returned to Rome, the Pope would almost certainly rule in her favor, not the king's. The reaction inside the chamber was immediate. Observers recorded visible shock among the judges. Henry himself was momentarily silent. This was the first time the king appeared cornered. Catherine's argument was clear, lawful, and supported by the international community, especially Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. If the trial continued under church authority, Henry would lose. He understood this instantly. As Catherine finished her statement, she stood, bowed to the king, and left the court. She refused to return for the remainder of the proceedings. Her departure was a symbolic refusal to recognize the court's legitimacy. Catherine had achieved a temporary victory. Her testimony undermined the credibility of Henry's case. The judges hesitated. The ambassadors reported that public opinion favored Catherine. Even some members of the clergy privately admitted the legal foundation of Henry's argument was weak. But Henry VIII was not a man who accepted defeat inside a courtroom. Unable to secure the annulment through church channels, Henry made a decisive choice. He ended the proceedings at Blackfriars. Then he initiated a political strategy that would bypass Rome entirely. Through Parliament and his advisors, he moved to transfer all religious authority in England from the Pope to the Crown. This decision fundamentally altered the structure of English governance. It created the legal basis for the Church of England, headed not by the Pope, but by the King. The dispute was no longer about a marriage. It had escalated into a national transformation that reshaped law, religion, and royal authority. What began as a husband's attempt to end a union became a revolution within the English state. And Catherine's resistance, though principled, had triggered one of the most consequential political shifts in European history. After the collapse of the Blackfriars trial, Henry VIII moved rapidly to neutralize Catherine of Aragon's influence. His first step was symbolic, but intentional. He demanded that Catherine accept a new title, Dowager Princess of Wales. This title acknowledged her only as the widow of his brother Arthur, not as his queen. Accepting it would mean surrendering her legal claim, her political identity, and the legitimacy of her marriage. Catherine refused. Her refusal was not an act of pride. It was a legal strategy rooted in her understanding of canon law and royal protocol. If she accepted the new title, she would undermine her entire argument that the marriage was valid. Rejecting the title was essential to preserving Mary's legitimacy and her own status. Catherine understood that once she yielded even a small point, Henry would use it to justify every subsequent action. Cut to reenactment. Catherine at a writing desk, letters and documents scattered across the surface. Her response to Henry's pressure was systematic and deliberate. She wrote letters to Rome, urging the Pope to maintain jurisdiction. She wrote to her nephew Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire, asking for diplomatic intervention. She wrote to English nobles, appealing to tradition, religion, and legal precedent. These letters were not emotional pleas. They were structured arguments intended to slow Henry's momentum and generate international resistance. But Catherine's resources were limited. Henry controlled Parliament. He controlled the emerging Church of England. He controlled military force in the legal system. Each letter Catherine sent provoked new restrictions. Her advisors were dismissed. Her household was reduced. Her movement was monitored. Every tool of state power was turned against her. At this stage, the power imbalance became impossible to ignore. Catherine had truth on her side, legal precedent, religious doctrine, and decades of service to the English crown. But Henry had authority, and in a monarchy, authority outweighs argument. The documentary tone, Catherine had truth. Henry had power, and power won. Henry's next move was targeted and strategic. To break Catherine's resistance, he attacked the one relationship she valued most, her daughter Mary. Cut to reenactment. Mary, now a teenager, being escorted away by royal officials. Mary's household was dissolved. Her status as princess was revoked. She was reclassified as Lady Mary, a title implying illegitimacy. She was relocated to various estates under strict supervision. This was not punishment, it was pressure. Mary's separation from her mother was intentionally harsh. Letters between them were monitored or intercepted. Servants were dismissed or reassigned to isolate her. Visits were forbidden. Medical care and finances were restricted. Henry's message was clear and calculated. Submit or lose your child. Catherine understood the severity of this tactic. Henry believed maternal attachment would force her compliance, but Catherine held her position. She refused to acknowledge the annulment. She refused to recognize Anne Boleyn as queen. She refused to sign any document that jeopardized Mary's claim to legitimacy. Her resistance became both her strength and her downfall. By 1533, the situation had shifted entirely in Henry's favor. Anne Boleyn was crowned queen. Henry declared his marriage to Catherine invalid. Catherine was relocated to increasingly remote residences, first the Moor, then Ampthill, and finally Kimbleton. The isolation was designed to silence her and to remove her from the political landscape. But even in isolation, Catherine continued to write, continued to argue, continued to assert that she remained the rightful Queen of England. Catherine stood firm. She refused to yield. But the cost of her resistance, political, personal, and maternal, was devastating. And Henry was not finished. The final stage of Catherine's fall was still ahead. By 1534, Catherine of Aragon was no longer a political threat, But Henry VIII continued to treat her as one. She was moved to Kimbolton Castle, damp, isolated, and far from the centers of power. Her household was reduced to a small group of loyal attendants. Her movements were restricted. Her contact with the outside world was monitored, and she was still prohibited from seeing her daughter Mary. Catherine's isolation was intentional. It was designed to break her remaining resolve. Yet even in exile, Catherine refused to accept the redefinition of her identity. She did not acknowledge Henry's marriage to Anne Boleyn. She did not recognize Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, as legitimate, and she refused every request that she sign documents confirming her new status. To her final days, she signed her letters with the same unwavering formula: Catherine the Queen. This was not sentiment. It was a legal position. As long as she maintained that signature, she maintained her claim. Catherine's health deteriorated through 1535. The cold, damp conditions of Kimbolton worsened her illness. Reports from her attendants described persistent chest pain, bouts of weakness, and declining mobility. Henry VIII, however, offered no change in policy. He neither visited her nor allowed Mary to see her, despite both women requesting permission. The separation between mother and daughter remained absolute until the end. In January 1536, Catherine wrote her final letter. It was addressed to Henry. Even in her last communication, she maintained both formality and firmness. She forgave him, but she did not concede his claims. She did not retract her position. Her signature on that final letter remained unchanged. Shortly after sending it, Catherine died. Her attendants reported that she passed quietly, surrounded only by a small circle of loyal women. She was still officially treated as a dowager princess, not as a queen. The crown arranged no state funeral, no public mourning, no royal acknowledgement beyond what protocol required. Henry VIII did not attend her burial. This was the final expression of his determination to reduce her status. But history has its own mechanism for judgment, and its verdict rarely aligns with the intentions of kings. Henry believed he had erased Catherine, politically, legally, and personally. He believed her resistance ended with her death. But the consequences of his actions did not follow the path he expected, because the conflict he began did not disappear. It continued through the child he tried to marginalize. Cut to reenactment. A crown lifted, church bells ringing, then a slow pan across the coronation portrait of Mary I. In 1553, 17 years after Catherine's death, England faced a succession crisis. Edward VI died without an heir. Lady Jane Grey's claim collapsed within days, and the strongest claim, legally and dynastically, belonged to Mary. The same Mary Henry had declared illegitimate, the same Mary he separated from her mother, the same Mary he tried to remove from the line of succession. Against all expectations, the English people supported Mary's claim. She entered London as a legitimate monarch, the first crowned queen regnant in English history, not a consort, not a placeholder, a ruling queen in her own right. And when she took the throne, she chose her title carefully: Mary, by the grace of God, Queen of England, daughter of Catherine of Aragon. This was her declaration of lineage, and it was Catherine's final victory. Catherine's legacy did not emerge through political triumph or military force. It emerged through persistence, through legal clarity, and through a refusal to accept a narrative imposed upon her. Though she lost her title in life, she secured her position in history through her daughter's reign. Henry VIII changed England to remove Catherine, yet the Tudor line passed through her blood, fade out on Catherine's portrait. Henry VIII won the battle. He removed Catherine from court, from power, and from public life. But Catherine won the legacy. Her name survived. Her daughter ruled. And history remembers Catherine of Aragon not as a discarded queen, but as the woman who stood against a king and outlasted him in memory.